I don't know, maybe you could watch or listen to this again before right before we have our exam tomorrow morning. So at 8 a.m., bright and early at 8 a.m. All right, well, hello, good evening, and welcome to my very final Mr. Ippolito's online review for an exam review. This is exciting and kind of bittersweet because it's our final review that we're going to do. So I'm happy that you're here to join us. Make it really straightforward. This is all about the Gettysburg Address. And so what I'd like to do, first of all, is just kind of go over my my vision for what I think the exam is going to look like right now, the content that we're going to have on the exam, and then we'll just kind of go from there. And you can ask me questions. I would definitely love to go over anything because this, and actually let me do a screen share. There we go. So these are the questions, right? Like these are the core questions that I'm kind of basing the exam on. Am I sharing? Can somebody just give me some affirmation? I don't see, I'm on my Mac, and so I'm just sharing what I think is the correct screen.
Yeah, we should.
Okay, so you see the slides, yes?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these questions, not in any depth, but just kind of go over them just kind of really briefly, and then we can do a deeper dive on any one of these that you'd like. We've kind of gone over this in class, so but I'm happy to go over them in depth, but I'm just going to kind of skim through them first. Okay, so number one, what do you notice about the length of this address? So basically what I want you to notice there is that the speech is short, right? We've been talking about that a lot, 2 minutes versus 2 hours. So that was one of the things that I wanted you to notice, was it was relative to other speeches at the time. It was a brief speech. And why do you think Lincoln made it the length that he did? So, well, why don't we have just a deep dive discussion on that, and I will stop, and rather than skimming over and just like, this isn't like a speedboat. This is, instead of a speedboat, we're going to treat this like a submarine, right? We're going to do a deep dive on this one. So I want you, even if it's just unmuting yourself, you don't even need to show your face if you don't want to. But why do you think that Abraham Lincoln made the speech as short as he did?
Well, a speech doesn't need to be long to say a lot. So, I mean, he didn't bore people. I didn't get bored listening to his speech. And he definitely said, like the speaker that spoke before him, he said, you told more in 2 minutes than I did in 2 hours. So, I mean, I learned a lot from his speech. I would learn more from a 2 minute speech than from a 2 hour speech. And I really thought he said a lot. And yeah, I think a 2 minute speech is way better than a 2 hour speech.
I agree. I think if you share a 2-minute speech with 8th graders, I think they're more likely to pay attention. If you share a 2-hour speech, maybe not so much. One student in the chat said, I thought it was so people could remember it, because I don't think people could remember a 2-hour speech. Well, and one of the things that I didn't have you do, maybe just for the sake of time, but also because I don't necessarily believe in forcing students to memorize things, but one thing that some students will do is memorize the Gettysburg Address. It certainly is easy enough to memorize. It's only 2 minutes, and I would say I have much of it, not all of it, memorized. But I've been teaching this a lot. So there are several students who will memorize the entire speech, just like there are students who will memorize the preamble to the Constitution. So it's definitely a speech that can be easily remembered. And then Lexi publicly in the chat shared, I think Lincoln made it that way because he chose his words so carefully. 2 minutes was all he really needed to get the message out. And I would definitely agree with you there, Lexi. And I definitely want to emphasize the point that Abraham Lincoln, and this is, I think, supported by a lot of other historians who say that he was very, very intentional. He started, and if you take a look, and I hope that you took some time to take a look at, and it doesn't matter. I just happen to be going to the period 1 Google Classroom, but this is in all of them, right? So if you go to the Gettysburg Address, and if you go to the Google Arts and Culture, and this is something, if you have not yet kind of perused through this gallery, I definitely would strongly urge you to look through just up until the part where he gives the address. You don't need to like, I don't think you need to learn the story of after, what happens after the address is all done. But I think leading up to it, I think looking at this part right here, talking about the first draft of the Gettysburg Address, right? Like how he gave a speech shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg was on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And then Grant took Vicksburg on July 4th. It was like perfect timing, perfect timing. This big victory for the Union in the East, at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and then this big victory for the Union again on July 4th in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So both ends of where the war, both we call them theaters of operation, the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater, or the Atlantic Theater and the Mississippi Theater. So he is, you can see here shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, you can see that he is starting to kind of build in his mind what this is going to look like. And then the next part talks about him being a pre-writer. This, as it turned out, is I think,
Mr. Polito.
Oh yes, go ahead.
You aren't screen sharing, so we can't see.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for mentioning that. Better to mention it sooner than later. Okay, you're seeing my screen share now.
Yes.
Okay, good. So again, thank you for speaking up. So where I am, and this is this, you can find this regardless of what class period you're in. You go to Google Classroom, the Gettysburg Address, and click on Google Arts and Culture. And then it's going to take you to this. And so this is the story. And I'm going to urge you, if you haven't already done so, I'm going to urge you to read the story of how Abraham Lincoln got to the Gettysburg Address. So at least the story from July 6th, 1863, up until when he delivered it in November of 1863. So that would be my first thing that I would recommend to you. In terms of, being able to kind of address the history of the speech and what was behind it, right? Like what went into the speech. So, and again, please feel free to jump in if you have anything else that you want to share. There was one other thing here in the chat. Oh, there are actually lots of things in the chat. I thought it was because not many people were in his favor, so he made it short so the people who didn't want to listen didn't have to listen for a long period of time. Well, I would say that there were, not everyone was a Lincoln fan. I think a lot more Americans are Lincoln fans today than back in the 1860s. I think back in the 1860s, he was just viewed by many as he was a politician. He was a partisan politician. He was a Republican. I think if you're not a Republican, you might, if you're a Democrat, then you're going to think kind of suspiciously of a Republican, and vice versa. If you're a Republican, you might think suspiciously of a Democrat. So I think it's only that there were some people who were able to appreciate him at the time. I think he has been much more loved and appreciated since that time. There are some historians that also argue that part of what leads to like this Lincoln fascination, and I am a historian and a teacher who is totally fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. Part of what leads this to almost like this hero-like status, some historians argue, was his assassination. The fact that he was taken out before he had a chance to fulfill his second term. Like he had literally just been in office for a month, just a little over a month in his second term, when John Wilkes Booth, one bullet was all it took to extinguish that light. And so I think that's part of what leads to this Lincoln mystique. But yeah, so I would say to the student who privately messaged me and said, isn't it this, like there are a lot of people who didn't care for him and that's why I wanted to keep it short. That might be. And thank you to everybody who was saying in the chat, you're not screen sharing. Another student in the chat said, I also think he made his speech short because he wanted people to be able to understand and remember what he was saying. I also think he wanted to quickly get to the point and not say a lot of unnecessary things. And I do agree with that also. I think that Lincoln was, as I think it was either Nia or Alex, maybe it was Nia who said that he, and this is Alex here in the chat. I think, Nia, you were saying he didn't need to say anymore, right? He didn't need to use additional words. He crafted his words very carefully. He was very intentional. It wasn't like he just jotted them down like the urban legend. It's not true that, when you hear the rumor, Abraham Lincoln jotted it down in the back of an envelope on the train ride. He did not do that. He was careful. He wrote this over months. Another question in the chat, can we use the Pear Deck and other resources for the exam? You can use whatever resources you wish, but I will tell you this, the multiple choice, well, the exam is going to be timed, right? Exam will be timed. And I'm thinking I want to do separate multiple choice and short answer portions. And the reason for that is I would like for you to get your multiple choice results immediately. I want you to get that feedback right away. So as soon as you finish it in the Go Formative, boom, I would like for you to get a score so that you know kind of how you did, so you know how to proceed going forward. You can kind of, get a feel for how you're doing so far. You can get kind of immediate feedback from the Go Formative on the multiple choice question. So normally in a typical exam, I would have the multiple choice and then side by side within the same Go Formative as the short answer. And I think I'm going to split those up. Multiple choice separate from the short answer. And then another student said, I think he made it short so a wider variety of people could understand him. Yes, and I agree. And I think in a couple of classes, we talked about how President Trump was a successful communicator with so many people because of the word choices that he used. President Trump, I think, was a successful communicator in part because he tried to aim his vocabulary at like a 6th to 7th grade reading level. This is not a knock against him. This is actually part of his strategy, his communication strategy, is he wants to get kind of a lower education level so that a wider audience can understand him. I think if you look at like a President Obama, or you take a look at President Franklin Roosevelt or President Abraham Lincoln, I think they're trying to go for a higher kind of a more well-read audience. You take a look at the language in Abraham Lincoln's speech, and it's lofty language, but I think he kept it short. And I think he was able to keep it lofty because there was such high Bible readership back then, right? We talked about this before with question number 3, how so many people were able to connect to the speech right away because Lincoln chose to use the language of the Bible and kind of mirror that language. Okay. Lots of really good things. Thank you for jumping in. And once again, thank you for being here. If you want to throw something in the chat, I think I've kind of got it worked out now. So I've got my screen share and I've got my chat. So I think I'm good. So I think we talked about number 1 and I feel good about that. And if you just jumped in a little bit late and you want to hear the first part of the discussion, watch the recording when I publish it a little bit later on this evening. Number 2, what does 77 years ago mean? 87 years. We've talked about that. That was a question in the Kahoot, either yesterday or today, depending on when you played. But that leads into question number 3. What sort of language is this? And we did talk about this already previously in class, this language from the Bible and kind of mirroring the language of Psalms 90:10. So if you take a look at, and again, just to be clear, I am not trying to convert anyone to a particular set of religious beliefs, but I think it's important for you to understand the context of why Lincoln chose the language that he chose. So if I look up Psalms 90:10 and I look at the KJV, which is the King James Version, this is the language that he was using. The days of our years are 70 years and 10. So in this part of the Bible, the days of our years, our lifespan, the average human lifespan, 70 years and 10. So 70 is 3 times 20, 60 plus 10 is 70. And if by reason of strength, they be 80 years, right? So probably going to live to be 70. You might, if you're stronger, you might live to be 80 years. Yet it is their strength, labor, and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. This part of the Bible is talking about, this is how long we live. And when our time is up, our time is up. And so we talked about how Lincoln is, referring to the fact that our nation, because we are 77 years old, we've actually outlived a typical human lifespan, right? The United States has already outlived a human. And so let's give ourselves some credit for that. Like, let's be proud of this. Let's be proud of this achievement. Let's be proud of this accomplishment. And let's not let this country die, right? That's part of the message of his speech. We talked about this in class today. Let's not let this country die. He had 2 goals for the war. One was to create a new birth of freedom. And the second is, we have a great thing going. We have a democracy going, or a democratic republic going, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Let it not perish from the earth. We've gotten this far. We've gotten 87 years and we've survived. Why let it die now? Okay. I think I've spoken to number 3. Going back to the chat. First of all, how much is the test worth? I did say it's about 20 questions. Now, are those questions going to be worth 1 point or 2 points? I don't know. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 points approximately. But I don't know because the test isn't, I'm not finished writing it yet. Is that lingo fourscore used multiple times in the Bible? That's a great question. And honestly, I don't know if it's used in other places. I have not read the Bible cover to cover, so I don't know, nor am I a scholar of the Bible, so I don't know. But I know that at the very least, it's used in that one area, and it could be used in other places. And maybe with a little bit of Google research, you might be able to find if the word score is used to represent 20, particularly 20 years. It might be used in other places in the Bible. I'm not sure. That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for you, but I think that's something that's Googleable. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on. I feel like I've talked about 1, 2, and 3. Number 4, what is Lincoln referring to in the first sentence of the Gettysburg Address? So this is also another thing that, gosh, I would definitely recommend you have on hand, definitely have. And I already see a couple of students who are already on the text of the Gettysburg Address. So hello, Sharia and Ellie just jumping in. So the question once again, what is Lincoln referring to in the first sentence? This is not a complicated answer. In the first sentence, which is also the first paragraph, he's talking about the American Revolution. He's talking about the Declaration of Independence, specifically when our nation was created, July 4th, 1776, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition, to this idea, this proposal that all men are created equal. It wasn't the reality back then, but it was a proposition. It was an idea like, hey, what if we create a nation that is dedicated to the idea that all men are created equal? We didn't live out that in practice yet, but maybe Thomas Jefferson meant this as a mission statement. Maybe he meant this as like something to strive for, something to look forward to. So that's what he's referring to in the first sentence of the Gettysburg Address. That's the answer to number 4. Number 5, why does Lincoln say that we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground? Some classes asked me this question and others didn't. And so I think I've answered this in varying degrees, but I'll answer it because you're here. I'll answer this for you. He uses, this is very, so he's really good with language, right? He's a good writer. He's been working on this for weeks and weeks and probably months and months now. So he says, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, right? So in the middle paragraph, and by the way, I pointed out to some classes earlier, other classes, it didn't quite come up. Do you notice the progression of time periods? So the first paragraph here, it's the past, 77 years ago. He's talking about the past. He's talking about when the Declaration was written. And then the middle paragraph, now we are engaged in a great civil war. He's in the present. And then the unfinished work that has not yet been done, the third paragraph, third and final paragraph, he's looking to the future, right? We will give this nation a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So I love this past, present, and future. Such a good writer. Let's get back to the question though. Dedicate, consecrate, and hallow, right? So he's talking about, we're at a cemetery, we're doing a ceremony, we're saying some words, maybe there's a ribbon cutting. I don't know what exactly happens when you dedicate a new cemetery. I've never been at a new cemetery when it's been dedicated, but there are a few appropriate remarks that are shared and, some speeches given. But he says, in a larger sense, like, we're doing what we're doing. We're saying our words and getting up on a podium and giving our speeches, yada, yada, yada. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. So we can do all the speechifying we want to. We could have ministers and reverends and pastors and preachers and priests do blessings and dedications and holy water, whatever we want to do. But really what we do is inconsequential. Really what we do today At the end of the day, it doesn't matter much. And this is a reflection. Are you listening? I want you to listen to this part. This is a reflection of Lincoln's humility. Lincoln was always so humble. Like, it's not me. I'm just one man. It's not me. I'm like, he's just so, he is never boastful. He is never prideful. He is always very like, you know what? I'm no big deal. I'm no big deal. He says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. And how ironic is that? When Abraham Lincoln, being so humble, says, you know what? No one's going to care. 150, 160 years from now, eighth graders aren't going to be reading this speech. No one's going to care about this speech. And it's the most famous and perhaps the most significant speech in American history. But he's so humble. He's like, no one's going to remember what we say here, but they can never forget what they did here. Because what these men, the brave men, living and dead, like, right? Shout out to both. Shout out to the guys who survived. Shout out to the guys who didn't make it. Because we cannot consecrate, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground as much as they did. They, the ones who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. In other words, whatever magic, whatever blessings we're going to do, whatever speeches we give, that's nothing compared to the sacrifice that these men in uniform did. That the act that they performed here at the Battle of Gettysburg. And in a larger sense, not only the Battle of Gettysburg, but also the soldiers who are fighting all over the war. Okay, and I think I cited evidence from the text in my response. Did I not? I think I did. Okay, I'm going back to the chat. There's something else that caught my eye. Is the optional Insurrection in America Google Docs worth a grade? It will get you points if you would like to turn it in. If you don't turn it in, it's going to be X for excused, and it won't impact your grade at all. Good question. Okay, we're doing well. 8:22, and we're already on question number 5. So I think we're doing okay. If there are any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. We have a nice small group this evening. So shout out to my students who are here in the live here right now, and I'll give a shout out to anyone who's going to watch the recording in the future. So happy you're here, regardless of when you're here, but I'm especially happy for you, those of you who are here live. Number 6, what then can we do? What does Lincoln say is the task for us, the living? And I believe we kind of did a deeper dive in a couple of my classes today than maybe we did in period 1. So let's go ahead and do a deeper dive on this right now. What is the task remaining before us? Okay, so it is rather for us that he teases this. He teases this. I talked about this in a couple of my classes today. If we move on here, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. Actually, I need to back up. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. This is when he starts right here, is when he starts giving us instructions. And when I say us, I mean, I think, in my opinion, not only the Americans of the 1860s, I think he's talking to us as well in 2021, teachers and students like you. I think he's talking to us. So you can feel free to agree or disagree, but he's setting it up, and he's such a tease, because he's like, okay, I'm going to tell you what it is we're supposed to do. I'm going to tell you the noble work. I'm going to tell you all about it. It's really noble. It's really amazing. I'm going to tell you about it. He's teasing till finally you're like, just tell us what it is already. It is for us, the living, rather, to be here, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. What's the work? What did they fight for? What did they die for? He teases it a little bit more. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. So he talks about the unfinished work. He talks about the great task. Lincoln's being such a tease right now, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. Unfinished work, great task. Oh my goodness, my phone's ringing right now. Unfinished work, great task, that cause. He's teasing. What is this? Just tell us, Abraham Lincoln. that we hear highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And again, he's teasing. He teases it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. And then finally, he tells us. Finally, he says what it is. He says there are 2 reasons why these men fought and why they sacrificed. There are 2 reasons. Here's the first reason right here. He finally gets to it right at the very end because he wants that punch right at the very end. He's a really good speechwriter. That this nation, here's the reason why. Here's reason number 1, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. That's reason number 1 that he gives, that we should have a new birth of freedom. And I had a lot of students today give some really good explanations. The one that stuck out in my mind was Anthony Marquez. I'm going to give a shout out to Anthony. I don't know if he's here right now, but Anthony Marquez said in my 4th grade class, it was kind of like hitting a reset button. And so that kind of stuck in my mind. Like if you're having computer trouble or your phone freezes or your iPad freezes or your Chromebook freezes, what do? You restart it. You refresh it, you reboot it. You have you start it over again. And so Abraham Lincoln, maybe he's saying, you know what? We need a reboot. We need to refresh. We need a new birth of freedom. And that new birth of freedom is when we go back to the Declaration of Independence, we go back to that phrase, all men are created equal. And rather than putting an asterisk next to it, rather than saying all men are created equal, well, except Black people and except women and except Native Americans and except immigrants. Yeah, because we're really not treating those people like people. What if we had a reset? What if we go back to our mission statement, right? What if we go back to that original language that all men are created equal? And if we look at that language and we say, you know what? Maybe we should start actually living by those words. Maybe if we say we're a country that believes that all men are created equal, maybe we should follow through with that idea that all men are created equal. What if we did that? What if we had a new birth of freedom? We're ending slavery. This is basically what Lincoln is saying here. He didn't come out and say it. We'd had the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed some slaves, which allowed some African Americans to start fighting in the United States Army. But this is really where he takes the original understanding of the Declaration of Independence and he slips in a brand new understanding of the Declaration of Independence. So that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. I see some stuff popping up in the chat, so I'm going to get to those in just a moment. Thanks for your patience. That's reason number 1 why these men sacrificed and why they fought and they suffered and some of them died on this battlefield. That there shall be a new birth of freedom, that we're actually going to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. We're not just going to give them lip service. We're just not just going to say, oh yeah, that's something that was really nice. Thomas Jefferson, nice words. We're actually going to follow those words. And we're actually going to treat all humans like humans and not treat some humans like humans and some humans like citizens and other humans like animals. We're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to have some humans treated as property while other humans get treated like humans. All humans are going to get treated like humans, and we're going to have a new birth of freedom. So that's number 1. And then number 2, he says, this is reason number 2, and this is why we need to, this is the unfinished work that those soldiers who died here, that's the work we need to continue. It's the great task remaining before us, a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. In other words, we created a nation back in 1776 that was different than the monarchies of England and France and Spain and Portugal and Denmark and Norway and all the other monarchies, the kings and queens of Europe. We decided that we were going to do something different. We were not going to have an emperor like they had in China or Japan. We're not going to have a king or queen. We're not going to have a czar like they have in Russia. We are going to have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And we're not going to allow that government to perish from the earth because it is under threat right now. It is under siege. There is an insurrection happening in the United States during that time, 1861 to 1865. And we as Americans are going to stand up and say, we are not going to let this government fall apart. We are not going to let this nation fall apart. We are a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it is these soldiers who are defending that. They are defending democracy. They are defending representative government. This is what they're fighting for. that experiment that we started in 1776, that it does not perish from the earth. Okay. Getting passionate about this because, you know, this is my jam, Gettysburg Address. Let's go over to the chat. Could you quickly go over the main points about the actual Battle of Gettysburg? So, yeah, I think I can, yeah, remind me at the end. I can go over the main points, but remind me, because this is specifically, remember, this discussion is specifically about the Gettysburg Address, and I'm really not planning on doing anything on the Battle of Gettysburg, but remind me and I can give you like a two minute Cliff's Notes version. And if you really want to see a better, like if you want to see it and have it kind of be a little bit more visual, then go to Oversimplified Part 2, because they actually do a really good treatment of the Battle of Gettysburg in Oversimplified Civil War Part 2, which is, we watched, I don't know, a couple days ago, 2, 3, 4, 5, whenever we watched it, a few lessons ago. Another question in the chat: where will you post the recording of this? My plan is to post this as soon as it's done. It's going to render. It's going to, you know, tell me Zoom, the Zoom magic is working. And then when it's all done, I'm going to upload it to YouTube. So it should be available hopefully in like 30 minutes after we're done. Right. So it'll be on my YouTube. Are you going to post the Kahoot so we can practice it? Oh, I never even thought of that. Remind me at the end. Just give me a quick reminder and I can post that. Will there be any questions on the test about the Civil War itself? So questions on the Civil War only as it would relate to the Gettysburg Address. Yeah, so anything, if it's about the Battle of Gettysburg or if it's about the war, it is in the context of the Gettysburg Address, right? So I'm not going to be like, who was the general who did this and this? No, I'm not going to ask you that. No, this is about the battle. Excuse me. This is about the Gettysburg Address. The test is on the Gettysburg Address. Yes. Okay. We're moving on. Thanks for your questions. All right. We did number 5. We did number 6. So no questions about the Civil War. Well, I'm not going to back myself in a corner and say no questions about the Civil War, because if I said no questions about the Civil War, then some kid's going to come back and say, well, Mr. Ippolito, you asked me questions about the Gettysburg Address, and that happened during the Civil War. What I will tell you, a student who is privately messaging me these questions, is I do not plan to ask you any questions about the Battle of Bull Run or Fort Sumter or the surrender at Appomattox. Like those aren't directly connected to those details, while they're important, are not directly connected to the Gettysburg Address. I am asking you questions on the final exam about the Gettysburg Address. So if there's going to be a question on the Battle of Gettysburg, I don't know, maybe a geography question, like what state would you find Gettysburg? I don't know, something like that, right? So that would be what I would ask you about, because it's related to the Gettysburg Address, because the battlefield was like, the cemetery is where the battlefield was, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to be tricking you or like, what was significant about the Battle of Antietam, or what was so important about the Battle of Seven Pines? I'm not asking you that because it's not directly related to the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, I hope that answers your question, and we're moving on. Number 7, we already talked about the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. I just spent the last 10 minutes talking about that. In the last clause, what do you think Lincoln means when he says government of the people, by the people, for the people? We talked about that too. And then the similarities between Pericles' funeral oration and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I feel like I've talked about that, but I will talk about that again just in case. So for this one, I'm going to, that's a great question, and remind me, because I want to answer that at the end as well, because the question is, what are some good resources we should study for this test? Well, everything I'm talking about is a good resource. Excuse me. But I want to circle back to that at the end, because right now I want to talk about this because I really want to get through. We're on the very last question here. So if you were still kind of iffy about this Pericles funeral oration question, I want to get to that first. So I showed you this, the roots of American government. We already did this lesson. We did most of this lesson, but I think I don't know how much of the Pericles funeral oration we got to back in September. So I'm now circling back to it now. So if you recall, and I think we've already gone through this in class, but I'll just kind of go through it quickly. In the Loki clip here, right? So Loki This is a clip from the Avengers. And he goes out in front of the museum and he's got all the people out there. This is in Germany. And he says, kneel. And he's forcing everyone to kneel before him because he's powerful. And, he's threatening to harm them. And so he says, it is the great unspoken truth of humanity. You were made to be ruled. He's talking to us as humans. We were made to be ruled. And wouldn't life be simpler if, he says it takes away your life's joy to have to make all these decisions, to have to choose for yourself. And wouldn't it just be simpler if choices were made for you? And so we had this discussion in class, right? Like, are we made to be ruled? And that's really the question of monarchy versus democracy, or monarchy versus a republic, right? Are we as humans, are we made to be ruled? Are we built as humans for people to just tell us what to do? Would we be better off with a king or a queen or an emperor or a monarch, a tyrant, a dictator? Would that be better for us if someone just told us what to do? And I think we have made the decision. We have said as a country, no, we don't. As Americans, one of the things that we cherish is our voice. We want to have a say. We want to have a vote. And part of the way that we vote in a republic is we vote for people who make those laws, people who make those decisions. In a democracy, you vote directly on laws. So in California, we do that a little bit. They're called propositions, right? Ballot initiatives or propositions where we vote directly on laws here in California. For the most part, the United States is more of a republic than a direct democracy. We vote for the people who make our laws, but we still refer to ourselves as a democracy because we cherish the right to vote, the right to determine our own destiny. We talked about this when we talked about China, looked at China and how they restrict religious freedom and individual liberties. You would be shocked. I've never been to China, but I've seen news reports from China. I see the kind of thing I've seen for years and years of my life, my 45 years of life, what all of the restrictions that take place in China, the restrictions on religious freedom and on freedom of speech. And the fact that, they have, for example, they have a social media service called Weibo. It's their version of Twitter. And the government censors it, filters and censors what people post online. As a matter of fact, I'll give you kind of a funny, the Chinese president right now is Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, it has been noticed, looks a little bit like Winnie the Pooh. And and people in China noticed that there was a similarity between these two. It is against the law in China for you to post anything where you make fun of Chinese President Xi Jinping by making him look like Winnie the Pooh or comparing him to Winnie the Pooh. You just can't do it. And here in the United States, we would be shocked by that, right? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, we make fun of our leaders all the time. People made fun of Donald Trump all the time. People now make fun of Joe Biden all the time. That's just the kind of thing that we do, is we make fun of our leaders. Late night talk shows, comedians, on social media, on Saturday Night Live. Like, that's a culture that we have built in, is we have such strong freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, that we believe it is our right to make fun of our leaders. That's part of the way that we speak out if we don't like something about our government, or even we just think somebody's funny looking, or we don't like their policies. It's not nice to make fun of somebody just because of the way that they look, by the way, but people make fun of like caricatures of politicians, right? That's what I meant to say. But that's not allowed in China, because there are restrictions on freedom of speech in China. There are restrictions on freedom of religion in China. So is democracy worth fighting for? And Pericles would say, absolutely, democracy is worth fighting for, which is why in Pericles' funeral oration, he talks about, he says, I don't want to make a long speech, right? This is like Lincoln. I don't wish to make a long speech, but I want to talk about why our Constitution and our way of life is great, right? We're a democracy because we put power not in the hands of a few, but we put power in the hands of the whole people. That's what we do in Athens. right? He's saying this is what we're fighting for. This is our why. This is our purpose. This is during the Peloponnesian Wars when they're fighting against Sparta. We obey the laws for the protection of the oppressed. Again, we need to go back to this question. This question is, what are some similarities between Pericles' funeral oration and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? So you see, and you can look, I don't need to go on and on and on. It's already 8:41, but you can look and see we relied not on secret weapons, but on our own real courage and loyalty. Our city is open. This then is the kind of city for which these men who could not bear the thought of losing her nobly fought and nobly died. There's that word nobly, right? These men show us, he's talking about soldiers. This is Pericles. These men show us what the meaning of what it is to be a man, their gallant conduct. They have blotted out evil with good. I think that Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery was evil. He said it in his speeches and writings. Now, he also said that, earlier on, before the Civil War, as a politician, he said, I don't have any intention of messing with slavery where it already exists. I just don't want slavery's further spread. But once the Civil War started, like once we're in the thick of it, and once hundreds of thousands of Americans have lost their lives already, at that point, Lincoln kind of has no choice. It was almost, some historians could argue, it was almost like if the South hadn't pushed it, if the South had just kind of not been so, had they not been so belligerent, right? Had they not been so warlike, then perhaps there could have been people in the North who would have been willing to negotiate. And there actually were. There were some people in the North who were like, you know what, let's just negotiate a peace. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying in this war. Let's just negotiate a peace and let's just let them go peacefully. And Abraham Lincoln's like, no, we have already had hundreds of thousands of people die. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of people die just to let the South go, just to let them be their own country where they have this two-class system. It's not going to happen. They're not going to get to go. You're not allowed to do that because this is what Lincoln, well, he doesn't come out and say it, but he says it without saying it. And I want you to listen to this. Lincoln saying, I'm the president for all Americans. And that includes Black Americans as well as white Americans, right? So there may have been white Southerners who voted for secession. There may have been those white Southerners who were like, we're out of here. We're out of the Union. We're out. But who asked those Black Americans living in the South? Who asked for their vote? Who asked them, hey, are you cool with the South just sort of breaking away and becoming a slave country? Are you okay with this whole Confederacy thing? Nobody asked them because they weren't treated like citizens. Nobody asked Black Americans because they weren't even being treated like humans in the South. They were being treated like animals. They were being treated like property. And so Abraham Lincoln was thinking, you know what? That's not slavery. Slavery is evil. The institution of slavery is evil. And this is the opportunity to destroy that institution. Okay, moving on. They thought it more, this is back to Pericles' funeral oration right now. I sometimes like to riff. They thought it more honorable to stand their ground and suffer death than to give in and save their lives. So he's talking about the sacrifice, right? The noble sacrifice, again, of these soldiers. And finally, talks about the greatness of Athens. This is what makes Athens great. What made her great was men with a spirit of adventure, men who knew their duty, men who were ashamed to fall below a certain standard. They won the most splendid of sepulchers, right? A sepulcher is a tomb, like a coffin or a tomb. Not the sepulcher in which their bodies are laid, but where their glory remains eternal in men's minds. For honorable men have the whole earth as their memorial. So again, here's Pericles, the leader of ancient Greece 2,000 years ago, trying to give meaning to the death of these soldiers. And then here's Lincoln at Gettysburg 2,000 years later, trying to give meaning to the death of these soldiers. Because the last thing you want, if that's your father, if that's your brother, if that's your son, the last thing you want is to feel like their death was in vain, like their death was for nothing, right? You want to know that if someone's going to die in war, that their death had a meaning. And this is Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address saying, these soldiers' deaths had meaning. They died for a cause. They died for two causes. In case we didn't get that the first time, here are the two causes. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Hit that reset button and let's live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and blow up slavery as an institution. And that this democracy, or this democratic republic, this nation, this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The two things that they're fighting for, the two noble causes that they're fighting for. Okay, 8:47. We got 13 minutes left. Let me look at the chat. We would need a guide, but at the end of the day, we would probably overthrow it. Oh, you're answering the question, like, are we made to be ruled? Okay. No one can't get through life without getting made fun of at least once. That's kind of sad, but it's true. Okay. Yes. So the South were the Warhawks. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Nia, because the Warhawks, many of the Warhawks in the War of 1812, going back 50 years, many of those Warhawks were originally Southerners. They were the Whigs who will become the Democrats. They were Southerners. They were from the South and the West. So they were from Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Yes, the Warhawks were from the South. And I will add on to that by saying, not only were the Warhawks in the War of 1812 from the South, but I would argue that the ones who were advocating most for the Mexican-American War, also members of Congress from the South. Yes, yes, and yes. Okay. All right. Hi. Okay, so I have three things that have been requested. Number one, I'm going to go kind of back in time. What are some good resources we should study from the test? So let me do another screen share. I'm sorry. I had the screen share and then I turned it off. All right. Let me know if I'm not sharing my screen properly, because you should be seeing Google Classroom right now. So if I were to say, like, what are some good resources? Well, if you want, watch this video over again. This is Ken Burns' Civil War about the Gettysburg Address. Watch that. I don't think you necessarily need to listen to the actor reading it again unless you want to. I think this is a really good resource right here. Otherwise, I would not have shared it with you. I think the speech is a good resource, the original Gettysburg Address. I think the Pericles funeral oration is a good source as well. I also will say this. In this assignment and period, if you're in my period 1 class, I shared this with you earlier this morning before school started. And I also added it to the agenda from yesterday. I said, here are some helpful areas of focus. So review the Pear Deck, which I've already talked about. Review Google Arts and Culture, talked about that. Review the vocabulary, the language of the structure. We've talked all about that tonight. Review the background story of the address as told by Ken Burns' Civil War piece and Oversimplified. And you can watch both of those. And then finally, review the similarities to Pericles' funeral oration. Those would be the things to review. If I were going to review, well, and we've spent almost an hour now going over the questions, the Pear Deck questions, right? So I feel like you should be pretty solid on those because we did those in class and we've done those again tonight. If you're exhausted, if it's like, Mr. Apolito, it's almost my bedtime and you're period 1 tomorrow, review Google Arts and Culture. I would do that next because I think that has some good resources in it and resources that like we maybe didn't spend a whole heck of a lot of time talking about, but I think that's worth it up to the point of the Gettysburg Address, November 1863. The stuff after like 1864 and beyond, don't worry about that. Just that first part, like I said. Okay, so those are the resources that I would recommend. The Kahoot, can I share the Kahoot? I can absolutely share the Kahoot, but I'll wait until after we're done and I'll share the Kahoot and I'll just push it out in the stream, right? I'll just push it out in the stream for everybody. And then that way you'll have it in the Google Classroom stream. So push to stream. And that way you can play that some more. And then finally, there was a question, can you go over the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, I can kind of go over it quickly. So it was a 3-day battle. Let me stop the screen share. Hi. It was a 3-day battle, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863. It was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was the second time that Robert E. Lee tried to move north, right? Second time he tried to move north and invade the north. This time he was trying to go for like this kind of this hook. Let's see here. Trying to go for this hook strategy. What's a good map here? Yeah, this could be a good. All right, let's open this image in a new tab. All right, this may be a little blurry, but I think this, yeah, it's a little pixely, but you'll get the idea. Okay, so so the Robert E. Lee's strategy was he was down here, and his strategy was like to do sort of this fishhook maneuver where he was going to go up and around and then into Washington, D.C. So like this fishhook maneuver right here, where he was going to take Washington, D.C. from the north. He was going to descend.
You're not sharing the screen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right. All right. Can you see the map now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So Robert E. Lee's strategy was to come, because he was here. This was they talked about this in the oversimplified video, right? So I'm just kind of repeating that. Up and around, a fish hook maneuver. You can see my mouse here. Let's see. Yeah, sure. Oh, wait. This could be fun. What if I did this? Oh, yes, we like that. Okay, so, oh, that's very exciting. I need to use this and zoom more often, the vanishing pen. So anyway, this was Robert E. Lee's strategy. He was going to swing around, and then he was going to attack Washington, D.C. from the north, like go through Pennsylvania and then drop down into Maryland. And that's how he was going to attack Washington, D.C. This, of course, right here is Gettysburg. And so this is where General George Gordon Meade from the Union Army, that's where, you know, he faced off with Robert E. Lee's troops and ultimately like just destroyed Lee's army. I mean, this was a humiliation for Lee, and Lee had to retreat back into, well, see, now I'm loving this, what's called the vanishing pen. This is cool. So yeah, so 3 days at by the apex of the second day, it almost looked like the South, like Lee was going to win. The Confederates were going to win another huge victory. Like that would have been super, super awkward for the Union if the Confederate army marches into Washington, D.C. That's game over because you capture the capital city. But they were stopped. Like it was so close, but they were stopped on day 2. And then day 3 tried to run, like go up the middle. You saw this in oversimplified, tried to attack the middle of the Union lines, and they just mowed down the Confederate army. The Union army just destroyed them. And so at that point, it was kind of the beginning of the end. And then eventually, as you learned in oversimplified, eventually Lincoln was like, you know what? Grant is winning battles out in the West. Why don't I just bring him? Why don't I just bring him out to the East and he can be my general? Because Lincoln kept going through general after general after general after general, couldn't get one whom he liked. There were some that got some important victories. McClellan got a victory at Antietam, and Meade got a victory at Gettysburg, obviously. But for the most part, he just had a lot of disappointing generals. So finally, he brought Grant in, and Grant he knew that he had a human advantage. He knew that he had way more troops than the Confederates. And so he just kept throwing more and more and more troops. More Union soldiers would die in battles than Confederate soldiers. But Grant was like, this is war, and sometimes people are going to die. And so he just kept throwing soldiers after soldiers after soldiers. He wasn't being cautious at all. And more troops. But eventually, because the Confederates had fewer troops, eventually the Confederates were just like, they had a numerical disadvantage. And so it was only a matter of time once Grant employed his strategy of just like, go, crush. It was only a matter of time before the Union was going to win. Okay. That was the Battle of Gettysburg. So I hope that was helpful. All righty. The last 2 messages in the chat. We can't see it and you're not sharing. All right. Well, thank you to whoever unmuted and said you're not sharing. So thank you. Any other questions? What's my favorite color? Blue, because I'm a UCLA Bruin. So I'm going to say blue. And I intentionally, so I was, I helped with the color scheme at Rio Norte, and we had a pretty even mix of UCLA Bruin fans and USC Trojan fans. And so part of the reason why we're blue and red, or red and blue, depending on how you look at it, is because of that truce between UCLA and USC. Little fun fact about Rio Norte, about your school. All right, but blue. Oh, Bruins are losing their softball game right now. Well, that's not good news. They're not losing to USC, are they? Okay. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop recording because I think we're done with our content now.